A disposable camera found on a lonely mountain trail held a haunting secret. Its final photograph, snapped in darkness, revealed only a boy's frightened eyes and nose. This eerie self-portrait is the last trace of 12-year-old Jared Negrete, who vanished during a Boy Scout hike in 1991. His disappearance has baffled searchers for decades and remains one of Southern California's most unsettling wilderness mysteries. In July 1991, Jared Negrete, a shy but friendly 12-year-old from El Monte, went on his first overnight Boy Scout camping trip. The journey began on July 18th with the troop camping overnight. By the next day, as they pushed toward the 11,500-foot summit, Jared struggled to keep up on the steep switchback trails, and he eventually fell behind the others. Rather than halt the group's progress, the troop leader decided the faster hikers would continue to the summit and pick up Jared on their way back down. Thus, Jared was left walking at his own pace, alone on the mountainside as evening neared. This is, of course, an extremely questionable and disturbing decision in and of itself, having the leader of the expedition leaving behind one of the most vulnerable members. In hindsight, if this hadn't have happened, this nightmare would have almost certainly been avoided. Some hikers later reported seeing the lone boy cutting straight down the switchbacks, and they urged him to stay on the marked trail. In fact, around 6 o'clock, one off-duty firefighter hiking through encountered Jared and warned him not to stray off route, and that was the last confirmed sighting of the boy. When the troop regrouped on the descent that night, Jared was nowhere to be found. Alarmed, the leader led the other boys back to base camp and then hiked down the mountain in darkness to summon help. By the time authorities were notified, Jared had already been missing for several hours in the vast wilderness. At first light on July 20th, 1991, an intensive search and rescue operation was launched. Teams of rescuers scoured the mountainside on foot and horseback, while helicopters swept the area from above. Rescuers came from across Southern California, and they searched day and night in rotating shifts. The terrain was unforgiving. Loose rocks, slippery slopes, and dense brush made every step perilous. Mount San Gorgonio's wilderness is a maze of rocky crags and sandy switchbacks, with many trails that lead to nowhere, making navigation difficult even for experienced hikers. Off the established paths, one can easily be swept into a ravine or end up obscured by thick vegetation in this treacherous region. Despite the dangers, officials held on to hope because summer weather was mild and fresh water was available from streams. Within 2 days, searchers found their first clues. On July 21st, footprints believed to match Jared's sneakers were spotted around the 10,000-foot level of the mountain. This discovery helped narrow the focus to a specific zone of the wilderness. Shortly afterward, search teams discovered pieces of beef jerky and some candy wrappers likely dropped by Jared during his hike. A week into the effort, on July 27th, the most significant find was made: Jared's disposable Kodak camera, lying about 50 feet off the Vivian Creek Trail. When the film was developed, investigators found 12 photos. Most were scenic shots taken before Jared went missing, but the final frame was a startling enigma. It was a blurry, extreme close-up of Jared's face, just his eyes and nose, taken at night with the camera's flash. At some point after his disappearance, the boy had pointed the camera at himself and snapped a picture in the dark. Family members who later saw this last photo believed that Jared looked frightened in it, giving a chilling glimpse of his ordeal on the mountainside. With these clues in hand, authorities concentrated their efforts below the spot where Jared was last seen. Dozens of searchers combed through creek beds, thickets, and rocky drop-offs in that area inch by inch. At one point, a blue water bottle was found and briefly raised hopes, but it was confirmed not to have belonged to Jared. Over the next 2 weeks, the operation grew into the largest search in San Bernardino County history. As many as 3,000 people in total participated, covering up to 50 square miles of wilderness in their exhaustive hunt. Volunteers, sheriff's deputies, forest rangers, and National Guard troops all joined forces in the massive effort. Jared's mother, Linda, hiked into the search area alongside authorities, determined to help find any sign of her son. Yet, despite clear weather and an all-out push, not a single additional trace of the boy emerged. After 16 days of exhaustive searching, officials made the painful decision to call off the official search on August 4th, 1991. By then, the chance of finding Jared alive was deemed virtually zero, and authorities had to presume the boy had perished. Veteran rescuers remarked in contemporary interviews with the LA Times that hikers often get lost in these mountains, but rarely do they disappear without a trace. In Jared's case, sadly, that is exactly what happened. He was simply gone, leaving his family and searchers with nothing to do but wonder how and why. In the absence of a definitive answer, several theories have been put forward to explain his disappearance. Investigators and family members have pondered these possibilities, but without new evidence, none can be confirmed. The most widely accepted theory is that Jared fell victim to the mountain's perilous terrain. All signs suggest he left the main trail and ventured into an unsafe area while trying to find his way down alone. If he slipped on loose rocks or stepped over a ledge in the fading light, he could have tumbled into a hidden ravine or crag. From there, the dense brush and jagged terrain might easily have concealed him from rescuers. The wilderness has many sheer cliffs and deep gullies blanketed with vegetation, and searchers noted that a person could quickly become invisible if they wandered off the path. Some involved in the search speculated that Jared appeared to have attempted continued shortcutting down the switchbacks until he ended up below the established trail. This would have involved descending into a difficult canyon, which was the same canyon where his camera and candy wrappers were found. Under such conditions, it's very plausible that Jared fell or became injured and couldn't climb out. The fact that no remains or clothing were ever found is unsettling, but it could be due to the vastness of the area and how thoroughly nature can hide a body. This accidental misadventure scenario remains the leading explanation in the eyes of those who have studied the case. Another angle considered whether someone else could have been involved in Jared's fate. From the start, investigators found no evidence of human interference, and there were no signs of a struggle, no suspicious footprints or items, and no eyewitness reports. While not entirely impossible, an abduction in that remote setting would have been difficult to pull off without alerting other hikers nearby. However, one theory suggested that perhaps Jared wandered down to a road and was picked up by an unknown individual, essentially kidnapped after surviving the initial night. This idea was investigated, but authorities eventually largely dismissed it for lack of any corroborating clues or sightings. In the end, nothing concrete ever emerged to point toward foul play. Law enforcement's consensus has long been that Jared's disappearance was most likely a tragic accident, not the work of another person. That said, while the authorities view this as a very unlikely scenario, it remains a potential possibility. Notably, because the region is home to wildlife like black bears and mountain lions, the possibility of an animal attack was also examined. However, this theory was quickly deemed unlikely. Search teams found no evidence to indicate a bear or cougar had attacked and dragged Jared away. Encounters with large predators are rare, and they almost always leave obvious signs when they do occur. Since absolutely no such traces were found during the extensive search, the wildlife theory holds little weight compared to other explanations. Jared's disappearance devastated his family and community. In September 1991, after hope of finding him alive had faded, the family held a memorial service in his honor. To this day, no trace of Jared Negrete has ever been recovered, and the case remains cold, despite being periodically re-examined by the authorities. And yeah, just before we move on, this story is incredibly messed up, because there's absolutely no reason this should have happened to Jared. And I don't say that to imply that bad things should happen to anyone I'm covering, but to say that this tragedy was both 100% preventable and also completely foreseeable. Leaving behind the least physically capable member of the hike just so you can reach the summit is incredibly messed up, to say the least. In the spring of 2007, a seasoned adventurer set out into the wilds of northern Arizona and never came back. Reinhard Kirchner was a 61-year-old physicist from Germany who loved exploring the rugged landscapes of the American Southwest. An experienced hiker in excellent shape, he had journeyed to the United States many times to trek through its deserts and canyons. This trip was supposed to be another grand adventure, but instead, it became a haunting mystery. Kirchner ventured into a remote area of the Navajo Reservation, a place of deep canyons, hidden sinkholes, and unforgiving terrain, and simply vanished without a trace. Reinhard Kirchner wasn't a novice in the wilderness. Back home in Germany, he had a distinguished career as a physicist, but his passion for adventure often drew him overseas. He had fallen in love with the dramatic geology of Arizona's Colorado Plateau, returning again and again to hike its trails and photograph its vistas. Friends and family knew him as a fit, careful, and well-prepared outdoorsman. By 2007, he had extensive experience in desert hiking and canyon exploration, and he even knew this particular region well from prior visits. Kirchner's personal life was also in a good place. He was engaged to be married and was planning to meet his fiancée in Las Vegas after his hiking trip. That rendezvous was set for April 9th, 2007, but unfortunately, he would never make it to that meeting. In early April 2007, Kirchner drove his rented pickup truck deep into a remote section of the Navajo wilderness in northeastern Arizona. He was heading for an area near a dramatic bend of the Little Colorado River, known as Hellhole Bend. This region of the Colorado Plateau is characterized by sheer cliffs that plummet into a 2,500-foot gorge and a landscape riddled with hidden sinkholes. In fact, Hellhole Bend earned its ominous name from the abundance of these hellish sinkhole pits in the ground. It is the kind of place only the most adventurous hikers would go, and Kirchner was certainly one of them. He parked his truck near the canyon's rim and set off on foot, likely for a day hike. When April 9th came and Kirchner failed to show up in Las Vegas to meet his fiancée, alarm bells rang. At first, those close to him wondered if he might have been delayed or out of cell phone range, but as the days passed with no word, it became clear that something was seriously wrong. Kirchner was reliable and kept to his plans, and for him to miss that meeting without any contact meant he was in trouble. His fiancée reported him missing, and authorities sprang into action. On April 12, 2007, searchers located Kirchner's abandoned rental truck near the rim of the Little Colorado River Gorge, about 2 miles from Hellhole. The truck sat on a lonely dirt track by the canyon, a silent marker of where he had begun his trek. There were no signs of foul play or any potential theft at the site, and it appeared that Kirchner had simply walked off into the wild and never come back. Finding Kirchner's truck triggered an intensive multi-agency search effort across jurisdictional lines, with both county and tribal authorities joining in. Coconino County Sheriff's search and rescue teams and Navajo Nation officials joined forces to scour the canyon lands by land and air. Helicopters crisscrossed the maze of cliffs and ravines, while ground teams and dog units struggled through the rocky, uneven terrain below. Over 6 days, searchers covered approximately 60 square miles around Hellhole Bend. This was no small feat, as the landscape is formidable at best and extremely problematic at worst. The gorge of the Little Colorado River cuts deep into the plateau, and one misstep near the edge can be deadly. Rescuers had to be extremely cautious not to become victims themselves. One of the biggest hazards in this area, and a possible key to Kirchner's fate, is the presence of numerous limestone sinkholes. These are deep natural pits in the ground, often concealed by desert scrub and hard to see until it's too late. Especially after dusk, it's perilously easy to stumble into one of these chasms without warning. Search coordinators noted that many of the sinkholes near Hellhole Bend were too dangerous to enter, so they lowered cameras in hopes of spotting any trace of the missing man. Despite these efforts, the search turned up nothing. Not a footprint, not a piece of clothing, not the hiking stick or camera that Kirchner was known to carry. After nearly a week of exhaustive effort, the official search was reluctantly called off with no evidence found. With no solid evidence to go on, those involved in the case have been left to speculate how an experienced hiker could disappear so completely. The leading theory is that Kirchner suffered an accident in the wilderness. Given the known dangers in the area, many believe he likely fell into a hidden sinkhole or over a cliff near the canyon rim. A fall from such heights or into a deep pit would be catastrophic, and it might explain why searchers found no remains. If Kirchner's body ended up at the bottom of an unseen chasm, it could remain undiscovered despite all the search efforts. The area is so remote and seldom visited that it's possible no one has yet come across any sign of him. Another possibility is that Kirchner became lost or injured and eventually succumbed to the elements. April nights in this high desert are deceptively cold, and the days can be extremely hot. A dangerous combination if you're stranded without shelter or water. Kirchner had only a day pack with him and was not equipped for a long ordeal in the wild. If he wandered beyond the initial search zone or got trapped in one of the side canyons, he might have been missed. Still, the complete lack of clues, such as a campsite or gear, makes this scenario less convincing. Foul play is an unlikely scenario but can't be entirely ruled out. The location is extremely isolated, and encountering a wrongdoer out there would be rare. Investigators found no evidence pointing to robbery or violence. His vehicle and belongings were undisturbed. All signs point more toward a tragic mishap than a crime in this case. Although investigators view Reinhard Kirchner's fate as a tragic hiking accident, some in the public have speculated about whether his disappearance is related to his profession. Kirchner was a physicist in Germany, a field that often involves sensitive research projects. While there's no evidence suggesting that he was working on classified or high-security projects, the mystery of his vanishing has encouraged such theories. Some suggest he could have been silenced because of knowledge he possessed. Others have proposed that he may have chosen to disappear deliberately to escape professional pressures. It's really important here to emphasize that these ideas remain highly speculative, with no proof connecting his physics career to his disappearance in Arizona. Still, the combination of his scientific expertise and the total lack of physical evidence has allowed these theories to persist in discussions of his case. While Reinhard Kirchner's disappearance is clearly both tragic and sad, I don't see it as a particularly dark tale like some have suggested. The most consistent and credible explanation for Kirshner's disappearance aligns with the official narrative: a tragic accident in an unforgiving landscape. Search teams noted the prevalence of those hidden sinkholes and sheer cliffs near Hellhole Bend, any of which could have claimed his life in an instant. With no signs of foul play and no evidence suggesting an intentional disappearance, the simplest answer is also the most logical. Kirshner was a seasoned outdoorsman, which some have used to argue that the case could be much darker, but even experts can be overwhelmed by the hazards of remote terrain. His case essentially illustrates how nature's unpredictability can overcome preparation and experience, especially in truly unforgiving terrain. Hey everyone, Jimmy here with a reminder to like and subscribe. Also check out the Lazy Chill History video podcast, where I'm currently rolling out the content from my history channel. I've included the link in the description, so feel free to drop in over there and leave a comment and follow me there too. It was like a scene out of a movie. A wealthy investor under investigation sneaks onto a private jet, whisking himself out of the country just ahead of the law. The fugitive vanishes into a string of tropical hideouts, taunting authorities who can never quite catch him. Decades later, rumors swirl that even his death might have been an elaborate hoax. This isn't fiction, but the real story of Robert Vesco. He's a man whose name became synonymous with high-stakes financial crime and one of the most perplexing disappearing acts in modern history. Vesco's saga is a cocktail of distilled greed, high-stakes intrigue, and pure audacity. In the 1970s, he was wanted for bilking investors out of around $200 million, making illegal political payoffs, and plotting schemes reaching the White House. Yet what makes Vesco's tale truly extraordinary is not just the scale of his misdeeds, but how he evaded justice by slipping through the cracks of international law. For nearly 40 years, law enforcement hunted him across the globe while he lived in luxury, courting presidents and dictators in search of safe haven. In the end, he disappeared so completely that even confirming his passing became a mystery. If you look at the start of Robert Lee Vesco's life, you could have never guessed that he was destined to be a criminal mastermind. Born in 1935, he was a high school dropout who first worked on Detroit's assembly lines before finding his way into finance. As a teen, he had vowed to escape Detroit, run his own company, and become a millionaire, ambitions he spectacularly achieved by his early 30s. By the age of 30, he had taken over a struggling machine tool company in New Jersey, turned it around, and renamed it International Controls Corporation. This meteoric rise made Vesco the young millionaire he had always dreamed of being, and if this is where it stopped, he may have been remembered as a successful business tycoon. But despite having pretty much whatever he wanted, his ambition soon veered into deeply unscrupulous territory. In 1970, he set his sights on a Geneva-based mutual fund empire called Investors Overseas Services, which was in deep trouble. Vesco swooped in and bought iOS for a mere $5 million, gaining control of an estimated $400 million of other people's money. The iOS accounting was so chaotic that, by adding a few subterfuges of his own, Vesco could plunder its holdings at will. Investigators later alleged that he hid the money via sham companies and even broke into a Swiss bank vault to seize shares. What followed was one of the largest financial scandals of the era. Once he had control, Vesco allegedly siphoned money out of the company through a maze of shell companies and deceptive bookkeeping. The U.S. Securities and Exchange Commission eventually charged that he stole more than $224 million from the iOS funds. These weren't funds owned by the company, to be clear. These were assets under management by the company itself. In essence, He had stolen other people's money on an extremely grand scale. By late 1972, the SEC filed a civil fraud suit against Vesco and his associates, accusing them of massive embezzlement. iOS soon collapsed, and investors eventually recovered only a fraction of their money. But by then, Vesco was long gone, and criminal charges loomed on the horizon. Facing imminent indictment, Vesco made a brazen move. In early 1973, rather than face justice, he fled the United States. According to later allegations, he loaded up his corporate jet with about $200 million of the looted assets and took off to parts unknown. This dramatic escape marked the beginning of Robert Vesco's life as an international fugitive. Vesco's first stop was the Caribbean, a region that would serve as his sanctuary for years to come. He initially landed in the Bahamas and then settled in Costa Rica, which had no extradition treaty with the United States. In Costa Rica, Vesco lived lavishly and quickly moved to secure his safety. He courted President José Figueres by pouring money into local business ventures, reportedly investing millions into his adopted country's economy. His largesse paid off, and the Costa Rican legislature, influenced by the president, passed a law ensuring Vesco couldn't be extradited. José Figueres, facing criticism for harboring a fugitive, said Costa Rica would take money from anyone if it helped the country. With this legal shield in place, the fugitive financier openly enjoyed life in Costa Rica, while American prosecutors mauled helplessly on the sidelines. The audacity of Vesco's bribery didn't stop at small countries. Before fleeing the U.S., he had tried to use his wealth to halt the SEC investigation. Through a chain of intermediaries, he funneled a secret $200,000 contribution into President Richard Nixon's 1972 re-election campaign. He had hoped the Nixon administration would quash the case against him and open him up to returning to the United States as a free man. That gambit failed, and two of Nixon's associates, John Mitchell and Maurice Stans, were indicted, and later acquitted, for obstructing justice in connection with the donation. Not content with meddling in one White House, Vesco later boasted of a scheme to bribe officials to lift sanctions on Libya. This event entangled President Jimmy Carter's brother in scandal. Still, from his tropical refuge, he showed how money could overcome ideology and borders. He befriended whoever could offer protection: democratically elected leaders, socialist revolutionaries, even narco kingpins. Simply put, he was cool with anyone who might help him stay out of American reach. Vesco's welcome in Costa Rica lasted until 1978. When Figueres left office and a new president took over, the government rescinded Vesco's special protections. Sensing the shift, Vesco slipped out of Costa Rica just before authorities could turn on him. Thus began an endless journey from one haven to the next. He resurfaced in the Bahamas, where he had cultivated ties to the Prime Minister and even Medellin cartel figures. He even tried to buy a small Caribbean island for himself at one point, but when that plan fell through, he kept up his itinerant lifestyle. Vesco traveled in style. At one point, he owned a private Boeing 707 jetliner outfitted with a bar and even a disco lounge. He spared no expense on mansions, yachts, and entertainment. But he knew that as a fugitive who hides in plain sight, he must constantly buy protection in each temporary refuge. Over the years, he burned through much of his stolen fortune doing just that. By the 1980s, his look had evolved from a boardroom executive to something out of Scarface. His slick suits gave way to sunglasses, open-collar shirts, and flashy sideburns. By the early 1980s, Vesco found refuge in Nicaragua, then governed by the Sandinistas. As with his prior hosts, he promised to invest and aid the economy, but no grand projects ever materialized, and he eventually moved on. In 1982, Cuba accepted Robert Vesco for humanitarian medical reasons, on the condition that he refrain from any financial mischief on their soil. Cuba had no extradition agreement with America, making it an ideal hideout, and for a time Vesco kept a low profile in Havana, living under the alias Tom Adams. Even Fidel Castro publicly said that Cuba didn't care about Vesco's past and wasn't interested in his money as long as he behaved. It was speculated at the time that Castro had simply let Vesco into Cuba for the sole reason of being a thorn in the side of the American authorities. It was, in essence, a small diplomatic and domestic propaganda win, hosting a man who was exiled from the United States. But for Vesco, old habits die hard, and despite Castro's conditions, he couldn't resist one more big scheme. In 1989, American prosecutors indicted him yet again, this time for smuggling, alleging that he had conspired with Medellin cartel traffickers. They alleged that he was working together with well-known Pablo Escobar associate and kingpin Carlos Lader to ship Colombian confetti into the States. Also, just as a quick aside, when researching this, I found out that as of 2025, Carlos Lader is a free man. I feel like I need to do a segment on him at some point in the future, but I digress. Safely entrenched in Cuba, Vesco shrugged off that American indictment, but a few years later he embarked on an even more bizarre venture that would ultimately be his undoing. In the early 1990s, he teamed up with a member of President Nixon's family and a rogue ex-CIA agent to promote a supposed miracle drug called TX. The pitch was straight out of a late-night infomercial. They claimed it could boost the immune system and eliminate literally any disease, and he was intent on selling this idea to the Cuban government. For a brief moment, Vesco reinvented himself as a biotech entrepreneur, even convincing Cuban authorities to let him conduct what I'll loosely call clinical trials. Reality caught up with Vesco in May 1995. The Cuban government discovered the wonder drug venture was a scam and promptly arrested Vesco. In 1996, he was convicted of fraud and illicit economic activities and sentenced to 13 years in a Cuban prison. The man who once hopped countries with impunity was now behind bars in the very nation that had given him his most permanent refuge. Vesco remained behind bars in Cuba for nearly a decade until he was finally released in 2005. In declining health and in his 70s, Vesco was quietly released to live out his final days under Cuban supervision. After decades of indulgence, he was a frail shadow of his former self, and for most people, this would be where the story ends. But for Vesco, one final twist in his saga was yet to come. The end of Robert Vesco's life is shrouded in uncertainty and rumor. According to multiple reports, Vesco died on November 23, 2007 in Havana at age 72, succumbing to lung cancer. In true Vesco fashion, news of his death was not announced by Cuban officials. It was only months later that journalists uncovered records of his burial and photographs suggesting his fate. A Havana cemetery log showed that a Robert Vesco was interred on that date, and images surfaced of an emaciated Vesco in a hospital bed and later in a coffin. These pointed to a quiet end for the fugitive financier. Yet many were not convinced, and his own former associates immediately suspected a hoax as Vesco had used disguises to escape in the past. Indeed, one of his closest confidants, a rogue CIA agent named Frank Turpil, flatly rejected the official story. Turpil claimed that his friend had slipped out of Cuba and was living secretly in Sierra Leone. According to this theory, the ailing old man in the photos was real, but the death was staged so Vesco could vanish under a new identity. And if anyone could manage that feat, it was definitely Vesco. Whether Robert Vesco truly perished in Cuba or slipped off the radar forever, his vanishing act stands as one of the most notorious in modern criminal history. He left behind a trail of ruined companies and lives. His journey, from working-class Detroit dropout to globe-trotting fugitive financier, is a story that's stranger than fiction. But that's not where the story ends, and Vesco's story gets even weirder, potentially at least. One of the most persistent theories about Robert Vesco's ability to elude capture for decades is that he may have been connected to American intelligence services. Critics point out that few fugitives managed to evade the combined pressure of the FBI, the Department of Justice, and other agencies for as long as Vesco did. This is especially true when his crimes involved hundreds of millions of dollars and the most powerful people in the world. Some argue that his reach into political circles, from Nixon's inner circle to involvement in shadowy dealings with Cuba and Libya, was no mere chance. They suggest he wasn't simply a rogue financier, but someone whose activities intersected with American covert interests. Supporters of this theory highlight Vesco's connections to figures with CIA backgrounds and his ability to operate freely in countries that were usually hostile to American fugitives. They speculate that Vesco may have acted as an asset, using his wealth and global contacts to open doors, pass along information, or grease diplomatic wheels. While no concrete evidence has ever surfaced proving such a relationship, it does explain how a working-class kid from Detroit could spend his entire life apparently evading the authorities. As thunder rolled over the waves of Lake Michigan in September 1679, a pioneering ship named Le Griffon vanished into history. This was no ordinary vessel. It was the first full-sized sailing ship ever to ply the upper Great Lakes, built by the ambitious French explorer René Robert Cavelier, Sieur de La Salle. Loaded with valuable furs and a crew of 6 for her return journey, Le Griffon set out from a remote island trading post with a favorable wind, only to disappear without a trace. In the blink of an eye, the Great Lakes' first great ship became its first great mystery. For more than 3 centuries since, historians, divers, and dreamers have wondered what happened to Le Griffon. After all, a 45-ton bark, armed with cannons, vanishing without a trace in the wilderness of the Great Lakes, is a highly unusual event. La Salle was a man with a plan, and in the late 1670s, this French explorer envisioned establishing a fur trade empire and finding a water route to China via the elusive Northwest Passage. To achieve these ambitious goals, he needed more than canoes. He needed a ship to navigate the Great Lakes and carry large cargoes of pelts and supplies. So, in 1679, deep in the Niagara wilderness above the falls, La Salle oversaw the construction of a 45-ton vessel he christened Le Griffon. And yeah, I'm going to let you take an educated guess as to what mythical creature he named the ship after. Built from local timber and fitted with 7 cannons, it was by far the largest ship the region had ever seen, astonishing the Native American tribes who watched this fortress take shape. La Salle launched Le Griffon on the upper Niagara River in the summer of 1679, marking the beginning of the end of the dominance of canoes in the Great Lakes. His ship, the first of its kind to sail beyond Niagara Falls, embarked with a crew of 32 men and a Jesuit priest, Father Louis Hennepin, aboard as chronicler. They traversed Lake Erie, navigated up the Detroit and St. Clair rivers into Lake Huron, and pressed onward into the uncharted waters of Lake Michigan. By the time Le Griffon reached the far end of Lake Michigan, it had proved that large vessels could operate in these waters, eventually paving the way for future ships and settlements in the region. La Salle's expedition reached its furthest point at a small island at the entrance of Green Bay on Lake Michigan in early September 1679. There, the French crew met with the Potawatomi people who had amassed a huge stockpile of pelts in anticipation of Le Griffon's arrival. La Salle decided to continue exploring inland, but he sent Le Griffon back east to deliver the valuable cargo. On September 18th, 1679, after riding out a gale for 4 days at anchor, the ship's pilot and 5 crew set sail from the island bound for the Niagara River. The ship was loaded down with an estimated 12,000 pounds of furs, an amount that was intended to pay off La Salle's massive debts. As La Salle watched her disappear over the horizon, he never imagined it would be the last time he saw his groundbreaking ship. Not long after leaving the sheltered harbor, Le Griffon sailed straight into a brewing storm over Lake Michigan. Local Potawatomi observers had warned the crew that a storm was coming and urged them not to depart. According to legend, the crew informed them that, quote, "A griffin does not fear the wind," a quote which was almost certainly added later for dramatic flair. Once out in open water, legend claims that the vessel met the full fury of the gale. Father Hennepin, the Jesuit priest, later wrote that the ship was tossed by violent winds and then simply vanished, possibly swallowed by the waves. However, he wasn't a personal witness to the event, and his source appears to be his own speculation combined with the accounts of native witnesses. These witnesses didn't actually see what happened to the ship, however, but rather, at best, they saw it leave in a storm. La Salle, waiting in vain for his ship's return, realized by late November that it was hopelessly overdue and likely lost. According to some accounts, he sent out a search party which found scraps of wreckage from a wooden ship. Given that his ship was the only old-world European-style sailing ship in that part of the Great Lakes ever, if this account is true, this confirmed his worst fears. The sudden disappearance of Le Griffon spawned countless theories. With no survivors to tell the tale, people filled the void with speculation. The most notable theory is that it simply sank in a storm, and there's some circumstantial evidence to support this. However, La Salle himself began to believe that something entirely different happened. La Salle grew convinced that his ship didn't sink by accident but was sabotaged. In a 1683 letter, he expressed his belief that the Griffin's pilot and crew might have intentionally scuttled the ship and ran off with the furs. According to this theory, the mutineers' plan unraveled when they were allegedly captured by native bands before they could get far. However, no concrete proof of a mutiny ever emerged, and La Salle himself would perish a few years later before the matter could be fully investigated. Another story claims that a band of warriors of the Ottawa tribe boarded the Griffin at anchor, eliminated the crew, looted the cargo, and burned the ship. This tale was recorded years later by a French missionary, but based on hearsay, and even he doubted its veracity. This missionary may have believed that the man who was telling him this story was trying to win French support against the Ottawa for secondary gain. That is to say, the French missionary thought that this individual was simply making the story up to further his own cause, or the cause of his tribe. No direct evidence has ever surfaced that any tribe attacked the ship, and no native oral histories have been connected to such an incident. Notably, if the incident did occur and these warriors were able to get their hands on 12,000 pounds of furs, this story would almost certainly have been repeated for generations. Despite these tales, no conclusive evidence has ever emerged to pinpoint Le Griffon's exact fate. The ship's end remains an open question, though most scholars still lean toward the storm on Lake Michigan as the most plausible culprit. The ship's elusive wreck has become legendary among shipwreck hunters. Since the 19th century, over 20 claims have surfaced from various corners of Lakes Michigan and Huron, each purporting to have found the long-lost vessel. Old timbers on a beach here, a mysterious hull there, yet each time, inspection proved it was another ship, or lacked any definitive link to LaSalle's ship. Searchers have continued to hunt for the ship up until the present day, though no site has ever been definitively linked to the wreck.